"Sir, the HOA says you're trespassing on community property." The words hit me before the screen door even finished creaking open, and for a second all I could hear was the low hum of the patrol car idling at the curb. That steady engine vibration mixing with the faint smell of hot rubber and sun-baked asphalt rising off my driveway. The same driveway I had paid for, surveyed, and triple-checked before signing a single document. And now 2 uniformed officers were standing on it like it belonged to someone else. I stepped out slowly, gravel crunching under. My boots, morning air still cool but already carrying that dry Texas heat creeping in, and behind them, just over the hood of the cruiser, I saw her, Patricia Whitmore, standing perfectly still with her arms folded. That tight smile she wore like a badge of authority, the kind that said she'd already decided how this was going to end. I didn't say anything at first, just took in the scene. The flashing red and blue reflections bouncing off my garage door, the clipboard in one officer's hand, the faint crackle of a radio somewhere in the car. And I remember thinking how fast things escalate when someone believes rules matter more than facts. "You Daniel Carter?" the older officer asked, calm but firm, the kind of tone that comes from years of dealing with situations exactly like this, and I nodded, keeping my voice steady when I answered, "That's me." Because I'd learned a long time ago that tone matters more than volume. "We received a complaint that you're refusing to comply with HOA regulations and occupying restricted property," he continued, glancing down at his notes like the paper might somehow make it true. And I could feel Patricia's eyes on me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to argue, to raise my voice, to give her something she could use. Instead, I let the silence sit for half a second longer than comfortable, just enough to shift the weight of the moment. And then I said the only thing that mattered, the one sentence that had started all of this: "I'm not in their HOA." And even as the words left my mouth, I could hear Patricia's soft, almost amused exhale behind the officers, like she'd been waiting for that exact line. The younger officer frowned slightly, flipping a page on his pad. "Ma'am stated your property falls within the association boundaries," he said. And I could already see how this was being framed, how easily a confident voice and a printed map could blur the truth for someone who didn't live here, didn't know the lines the way I did. I looked past them for a moment, out toward the edge of my lot where the fence line met the open stretch of land I'd chosen. Specifically because it sat just outside their jurisdiction, no shared roads, no covenants, no monthly dues disguised as community pride, just clean ownership, clear boundaries, and the quiet understanding that what was mine stayed mine. I could feel the tension building, that invisible pressure that makes most people rush to defend themselves, to pull out papers, to prove something on the spot. But I didn't move, didn't reach for the folders sitting inside on my kitchen counter, didn't point to the survey markers set in concrete along my property line. Instead, I met the officer's eyes and said, "I understand, officer, and I'm happy to cooperate." And that was the moment everything shifted, subtle but real, because cooperation isn't the same as agreement, and documentation isn't the same as truth. And somewhere behind me, through the open door, I could hear the faint tick of my wall clock marking each second like it mattered, because it did, because every word spoken here, every note written on that clipboard, every assumption made based on Patricia's version of reality was becoming part of something bigger, something official. And as I stood there, calm, steady, letting them ask their questions, letting her talk just a little too much, I realized this wasn't about convincing anyone on my driveway. This was about letting the right people hear the wrong story exactly the way she wanted to tell it. Because sometimes the strongest move you can make isn't correcting the mistake in front of you. It's letting it be recorded exactly as it is. The officer's pen scratched steadily across the paper, slow and deliberate, like every word carried weight, and I could hear it clearly over everything else, over the idling engine, over the faint wind brushing through the dry grass at the edge of my property, even over Patricia's voice as she stepped forward just enough to insert herself into the conversation again. "He has been non-compliant for weeks," she said, that same polished tone, controlled but sharp around the edges. "We have sent multiple notices, multiple warnings, and he continues to ignore community standards." And I noticed the way she emphasized community, like it was something sacred, something I was refusing to respect, when in reality it was something I had intentionally stayed out of. The older officer glanced at her, then back at me, Is that accurate, sir? And I gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the situation as she saw it. She has sent notices, yes, I said, keeping my voice even, measured, because facts matter more than tone when they are written down. And I could see the younger officer shift slightly, like he was trying to piece together where the line actually was. And you are choosing not to comply? He asked, and there it was, the assumption baked into the question, the quiet presumption that rules had already been established, and I was simply refusing to follow them. I let a breath out slowly, feeling the dry air catch in my throat, and answered exactly how I needed to. No more, no less. I am choosing to follow the law as it applies to my property. And that made the older officer pause for just a second, just enough to register that this was not a typical dispute about paint colors or mailbox height. And behind them, I caught the smallest flicker of irritation cross Patricia's face, gone almost instantly, replaced by that same tight smile. Sir, do you have documentation that your property is not part of the HOA? The older officer asked, and I could feel the moment pivot again, because this was where most people would rush inside, grab a stack of papers, try to prove everything right there on the spot. But proving something in the moment is not the same as establishing a record, and I knew which one mattered more, so I shook my head slightly, not dismissive, just calm. I have documentation, yes, but I would prefer to provide it through the proper channels. And the younger officer blinked like he did not expect that answer, while Patricia let out a short, incredulous laugh behind them. Proper channels, she said, stepping closer, heels clicking against the pavement. This is the proper channel. Officers are here because he refuses to comply with a legally binding association. And the word legally hung in the air like something solid, something she believed could not be questioned. I turned my head just enough to look at her, not confrontational, just direct, and said, Ma'am, with respect, that is exactly what needs to be verified. And for the first time, there was a crack, just a hairline fracture in her confidence, the kind that only shows when someone realizes the ground beneath them might not be as stable as they thought. The older officer cleared his throat softly, bringing the focus back. All right, here is what we are going to do, he said, tone steady, practiced. We are going to document the complaint, note your statement, and this will likely become a civil matter moving forward. And that was the word I had been waiting for, civil, because civil means records, and records mean evidence, and evidence means timelines that cannot be rewritten later. I nodded again, I understand, and stepped back just slightly, giving them space, letting them continue their process without interruption, while Patricia opened her mouth like she wanted to push further, to escalate again, but hesitated when she realized the officers were no longer leaning toward her version of events, just observing, just recording. And in that quiet shift, standing there with the sun climbing higher and the heat starting to press down on the pavement, I could feel the entire situation changing direction, not because I argued louder, not because I proved anything in that moment, but because I did not need to. Because every assumption she made, every statement she pushed, every time she said legally without actually verifying it was now being written down, timestamped, and filed. And as the officer tore the top sheet from his pad and handed me a copy, the paper still warm from the pressure of his pen, I realized something simple but powerful. This was no longer her story to control. The paper felt lighter than it should have in my hand, just a thin copy of a report. But I knew better, because it was not the weight of the paper that mattered. It was what it represented, a timestamp, a version of events locked in before anyone had the chance to rewrite it. And as the patrol car doors shut with that solid, hollow thud and the engine noise faded down the street, the silence that followed felt different, heavier, like the air itself had shifted. I stood there for a moment. Longer, eyes on the edge of my property where the survey marker sat half buried in dry soil. A small metal pin most people would never notice, but to me it was the line that defined everything. And behind me, I heard Patricia's heels again, slower this time, measured, like she was recalibrating. You really think this is going to hold up? She said, her voice lower now. Less performance, more calculation. And I turned just enough to face her without stepping forward, keeping that same distance that had kept everything clean so far. I think the truth usually does, I replied. Simple, nothing extra, because over-explaining is where people start to lose ground. She let out a short breath, something between a laugh and frustration. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," she said. And there it was again. That assumption that compliance was the easier path, that pushing back was unnecessary friction. And I could see it clearly now. This was not about rules for her. It was about control, about maintaining a system where nobody questioned where her authority actually ended. "No," I said quietly. "I am making it accurate." And that word hung there for a second. Accurate. Because accuracy does not bend to pressure. It does not adjust for convenience. It just is. She shook her head slightly, that smile tightening again. "We will see what the board says about this," she replied, already pivoting back into structure, into hierarchy, into the comfort of a system she believed. She controlled, and I nodded once. "I am sure we will." Because I knew something she did not, something she had not taken the time to verify. I watched her walk back toward the street, phone already in her hand, probably drafting emails, probably preparing statements, and I could almost hear the language she would use: noncompliance, violation, enforcement, words that sound official until you actually check where they apply. And when she disappeared past the line of parked cars, I turned and stepped back inside my house, the cool air hitting my face, carrying the faint smell of coffee I had forgotten on the counter, now lukewarm, sitting beside the folder I had deliberately left untouched earlier. I picked it up slowly, flipping it open, the familiar texture of printed surveys and stamped documents sliding under my fingers, each page clean, clear, precise, the boundary lines drawn in exact measurements, bearings, coordinates, everything mapped out down to the inch. And at the top of the first page, the line that mattered most: property excluded from Willow Creek HOA jurisdiction. Not suggested, not implied. Excluded, confirmed by county records and signed by a licensed surveyor whose name carried more weight than any HOA board vote ever could. I set the folder down on the table and walked over to the window, looking out at the same driveway where everything had just unfolded. And for a moment, I let myself replay it, not emotionally, but analytically, the questions asked, the answers given, the way Patricia framed her statements, the exact phrasing she used when she said, "legally binding," because words like that matter when they are written down, especially when they are not true. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the recordings I had started weeks ago, each file labeled with a date and time, each conversation captured clearly, not because I expected things to escalate this far, but because I understood how quickly misunderstandings can turn into claims, and how important it is to have a record that does not rely on memory. One file in particular caught my eye, a conversation from 3 days ago, Patricia standing right where the officers had been, telling me, "If you do not comply, we will escalate this legally." And I remembered. The exact tone she used, confident, certain, like legality was something she could declare into existence. And now, with everything that had just been documented, I realized the situation had quietly crossed a line she had not even seen, because this was no longer about whether I followed her rules. It was about whether she had overstepped hers. And as I stood there, the afternoon sun beginning to cast longer shadows across my yard, I understood something that most people learn too late. The moment someone tries to enforce authority they do not actually have, they stop being in control of the outcome. And from that point on, everything they say becomes evidence. The house felt quieter than usual that afternoon, like the walls themselves were holding on to what had just happened, and I stood there in my kitchen with the folder still open in front of me, sunlight cutting across the table and lighting up the survey lines like they were etched into something permanent, something undeniable, and I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the paper, not because I needed to read it again, but because I needed to remind myself that everything here was real, documented, verified long before Patricia ever decided to make my property part of her authority. I took a slow sip of the coffee, now lukewarm and slightly bitter, and set the mug down as I pulled my laptop closer, the soft click of the keys echoing in the quiet as I opened the county records database, the same one I had used weeks ago when the first letter showed up in my mailbox, printed on thick paper with bold lettering and just enough legal language to sound official if you did not know better. I could still remember that moment clearly, the faint smell of fresh ink when I tore open the envelope, the way the words violation notice seemed to jump off the page like they already carried weight, even though they had none, not legally, not on my property. And that was the moment I realized this was not going to stay simple. The screen loaded slowly, spinning icon turning like it always did, and I leaned back slightly, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me, grounding myself in something normal while everything else shifted into something more structured, more deliberate, because this was where the real work happened, not out on the driveway, not in front of flashing lights, but here, where records could not be interrupted or talked over. I pulled up my parcel information, the same coordinates, the same legal description, every line matching the survey in front of me, and then I opened the HOA boundary file, overlaying the two maps carefully, watching the lines settle into place like pieces of a puzzle that had already been solved. And there it was again, clear as day, my property sitting just outside the shaded zone that defined their jurisdiction, not overlapping, not partially included, completely separate. I let out a slow breath, not relief, because I had never doubted it, but confirmation, because confirmation is what holds up when everything else starts getting questioned. My phone buzzed lightly against the table, a sharp vibration that cut through the quiet, and I glanced. Down at the screen, Patricia Whitmore, her name lighting up in clean white text like nothing had changed, like the scene earlier had not already shifted everything. And for a moment, I just watched it ring, felt the rhythm of it against the wood surface, steady, insistent, before I picked it up and answered, keeping my voice neutral. Hello, and there was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to tell me she was choosing her words more carefully now. Daniel, she said, tone softer than before, controlled but less certain. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was unexpected, but because it was exactly how this phase always begins, the shift from authority to negotiation once certainty starts to crack. I walked slowly toward the window as she spoke, looking out at the same driveway, now empty, the heat rising off the pavement in faint waves. We are just trying to maintain standards in the community, she continued. And sometimes lines can be unclear. And there it was, the first adjustment, the first acknowledgement that things were not as absolute as she had presented them earlier, and I let a second pass before I responded, not rushing, not filling the silence. Lines are only unclear when they are not verified, I said, calm, steady, and I could hear her inhale slightly on the other end, like she was recalibrating again. Well, perhaps we can resolve this without making it into something bigger than it needs to be, she offered, and that sentence carried more weight than she probably intended, because it revealed exactly what she was starting to see, that this was already bigger than a disagreement. It was a matter of record now. I rested my hand lightly against the window frame, feeling the warmth of the sun through the glass, grounding myself again before answering. I agree, it should be resolved properly, and I chose that word carefully, properly, because proper resolution is not about convenience. It is about accuracy, about making sure that what gets written down matches what actually exists. There was another pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again, the confidence was thinner, stretched over something less certain. I will have the board review the property boundaries, she said, and I nodded slightly even though she could not see it. That sounds like a good place to start, I replied, because I knew what that review would show, not eventually, not after debate, but immediately, because facts do not wait for approval. They just sit there, unchanged, waiting for someone to actually look at them. When the call ended, the silence returned, but it felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but structured, like everything had moved onto a track that could not easily be redirected. And as I stood there, looking out at the line where my property met the edge of theirs, I understood something simple but powerful. This was no longer about defending my position. It was about letting the truth move through a system that had already started recording their mistakes. The next morning started quieter than it should have, the kind of silence that feels temporary, like something is already in motion even if you cannot see it yet. And I was standing on my back porch with a fresh cup of coffee, steam rising slowly into the cool air, when I noticed the black SUV. Parked across the street, engine off, windows slightly tinted but not enough to hide the fact that someone was sitting inside, waiting, watching, not aggressively, just present. And that was the difference, because presence means intention. I took a slow sip, letting the bitterness settle, and leaned lightly against the wooden railing, feeling the grain under my palm, grounding myself in something steady while everything else continued to unfold exactly the way I expected it to, because once something becomes official, It starts moving whether anyone pushes it or not. About 10 minutes later, the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Mid-40s maybe, clean pressed shirt, no tie, holding a slim folder under his arm. The kind of posture that said he was used to conversations that mattered. And as he walked up the driveway, his shoes made a soft, measured sound against the concrete. Not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. "Daniel Carter?" he called out, stopping a few feet short of the porch, respectful distance, and I nodded, setting the coffee down beside me. "That is me," I said, and he gave a small, professional nod in return. "My name is Thomas Green. I represent the Willow Creek HOA." And there it was, the shift from personal confrontation to formal representation, from Patricia's certainty to something more structured, more cautious. He held up the folder slightly. "I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes," and I gestured toward the steps. "Of course. Because conversation, when documented properly, is just another form of evidence." He climbed up, stopping at the edge of the porch instead of coming all the way in. Another small detail that told me he understood boundaries, or at least respected the idea of them. And he opened the folder slowly, flipping to the first page with the kind of care that comes from knowing every word might matter later. "I have reviewed the initial complaint and the responding report from yesterday," he began, voice even, neutral. "And I also pulled the county property records associated with your parcel." And I watched him closely, not his words, but his pacing, the way he chose what to say and what to leave out. Because that is where the truth usually shows itself first. He paused briefly, then continued. "There appears to be a discrepancy between the HOA's assumed boundary and the recorded boundary filed with the county." And that word discrepancy landed softly, almost understated, but it carried more weight than anything Patricia had said the day before, because discrepancy means something does not match. And when something does not match in a legal record, it has to be resolved. I nodded once, not surprised, not pushing, just acknowledging. "I noticed that as well," I said, keeping my tone level, because this was not about winning a conversation. It was about letting the facts settle where they needed to. He glanced down at the page again, then back up at me. "Mr. Carter, have you at any point signed an agreement with the Willow Creek HOA or its governing body?" And I shook my head without hesitation. "No, I have not." And he held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, like he was measuring the answer against something else he already knew, then made a small note in the margin of his paper. "And to your knowledge, was your property ever annexed into the association after the original subdivision was established?" he asked, and I let out a quiet breath. "No, it was specifically excluded during the original filing. That is part of why I purchased it." And this time, the note he wrote was slower, more deliberate, like it mattered more than the first. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just heavy with realization. And then he closed the folder halfway, resting it against his palm. "I am going to be direct with you," he said, voice lowering slightly. "Based on what I am seeing, the HOA does not have enforcement authority over your property." And there it was, not loud, not dramatic, just stated, clean and precise. And for a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the yard and the distant hum of a car passing down the main road. I leaned back slightly against the porch post, feeling the solid wood at my back, and nodded once. "That aligns with my understanding," I replied, and he gave a small exhale, almost like tension releasing. Then, "There is something else you should be aware of," he added, tapping the folder lightly. "The report filed yesterday, along with prior notices, may create exposure for the association if they were issued outside of jurisdiction." And that word exposure carried a different kind of weight, not about boundaries, but about consequences, about what happens when authority is assumed instead of verified. I picked up my coffee again, now just warm, and took a slow sip before answering. "I had a feeling that might be the case." And he nodded once, more firmly this time, like the pieces had fully settled into place. And as he stood there on my porch, framed by the morning light, holding a folder that now meant something very different than it had 24 hours ago, I understood exactly where this was going next, not because I forced it there, but because they had already written the path themselves. Thomas did not rush to leave, and that told me more than anything he had said so far, because people who are confident in a simple resolution do not linger. They close the conversation and move on. But he stayed there on the edge of my porch, shifting the folder slightly in his hands like there was still something unfinished, something he needed to make clear before this went any further. "There is going to be a board meeting tonight," he said finally, his tone more measured now, less neutral than before. "And your situation is already on the agenda," and I nodded slowly, taking that in, not surprised, because once something like this surfaces, it does not stay quiet. It moves quickly through the people responsible for it, especially when there is risk involved. "Am I expected to attend?" I asked, keeping my voice even, and he hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "You are not required to, but it might be in your interest to hear what is discussed." And that phrasing stood out to me. Not required, but in your interest, because that is how situations shift from enforcement to damage control. I looked past him briefly, out toward the street where the black SUV was still parked. The morning sun now higher, casting sharper shadows across the pavement, and I thought about the timing of everything, how fast the tone had changed in less than 24 hours, from certainty to caution, from authority to review, and I could feel the structure of the situation settling into something more predictable. "I will consider it," I said, and he gave a small nod, closing the folder fully now, the conversation clearly reaching its end, but not before he added one more thing. "Mr. Carter, I would recommend you keep all documentation related to this matter organized and accessible." And there was a subtle shift in his tone when he said that, not advice for compliance, but preparation for something else, something that might extend beyond a simple correction. "I already do," I replied, and that seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once more, stepped back from the porch, and turned toward his vehicle without another word. I watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading against the concrete, the door of the SUV closing with a soft but solid click, and then the engine turning over, low and controlled, before the vehicle pulled away slowly down the street, leaving the neighborhood looking exactly the same as it had before, quiet, orderly, unchanged on the surface, but completely different underneath. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, the faint breeze moving through the yard, and then I turned back inside, closing the door behind me with a soft, final sound that seemed to separate what had already happened from what was coming next. The rest of the afternoon passed with a kind of focused calm, the kind that comes when you know exactly where things are headed and all that is left is to make sure every piece is in place. And I moved through my house methodically, gathering everything I had already prepared, the survey documents, the county records, the email exchanges, the recorded conversations, each one labeled, dated, organized in a way that made the timeline impossible to distort. I set everything out across the dining table, the papers forming a clean, linear progression from the first notice to the most recent interaction, and as I looked at it all together, I could see the pattern. Clearly, not emotional, not dramatic, just factual, step by step, how a misunderstanding had been turned into an assumption, how that assumption had been enforced as if it were true, and how each action taken on that false premise had now become part of a record that could not easily be undone. My phone buzzed again, a short, sharp vibration that pulled my attention back, and when I glanced at the screen, it was not Patricia this time. It was an email notification, subject line simple but direct, Willow Creek HOA Board Review Notice, and I opened it immediately, scanning the text as it loaded, the language formal, structured, outlining the purpose of the meeting, the review of property boundaries, the assessment of prior enforcement actions, and the potential need for corrective measures, each phrase carefully chosen, each sentence carrying more weight than it would have a day ago. I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to hear the tone behind the words. The shift from certainty to accountability, and when I set the phone down, I could not help but notice how quiet everything felt again, not empty, not uncertain, but settled, like the outcome was already beginning to take shape. I walked back toward the window, looking out at the line where my property met theirs, that invisible boundary that had caused all of this. And I realized something that most people overlook until it is too late. The moment someone enforces a rule without verifying their authority, they stop controlling the consequences, and from that point on, the system they relied on to support them becomes the same system that holds them accountable. The sun was already dipping lower by the time I pulled into the small parking lot outside the HOA clubhouse, The sky stretched in that late afternoon orange that makes everything look calmer than it actually is, and I sat in my truck for a moment with the engine off, just listening to the faint ticking sound as the metal cooled, feeling that familiar stillness settle in before stepping into something that was already in motion. Through the glass doors, I could see a few people gathered inside. Silhouettes moving slowly, papers in hand, conversations happening in low tones that carried just enough tension to be noticeable even from a distance. And as I stepped out, gravel crunching lightly under my boots, I caught the faint smell of freshly cut grass mixed with that artificial air freshener they always seem to use in places like this, something meant to feel clean but never quite natural. The door opened with a soft push, hinges barely making a sound, and the room inside was exactly what you would expect: folding chairs, arranged in neat rows, a long table at the front with nameplates lined up in front of each board member, bottled water placed evenly like part of a routine that had been repeated too many times to question. Conversation slowed as I walked in, not abruptly, just enough that you could feel the shift, heads turning slightly, eyes tracking, and I recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood. People who had probably only heard one version of this story so far. Patricia was already seated at the front, posture straight, hands folded on the table in front of her, that same composed expression in place but thinner now, like it was being held together instead of projected. And next to her sat Thomas Green, the same folder in front of him, now opened, papers neatly aligned, ready. I chose a seat near the back, not hiding, just observing, because positioning matters. And from there I could see everything without becoming the center of it. A man cleared his throat at the front, one of the board members, mid-50s, glasses low on his nose. "All right, let us bring this meeting to order," he said, voice steady but carrying that underlying tension of someone who already knows this is not going to be routine. And as the room settled into silence, the sound of chairs adjusting, a pen tapping lightly against a notebook, I could feel the weight of what was about to be discussed. "Next item," he continued, glancing down at the agenda in front of him, "property boundary clarification. An enforcement review regarding Mr. Carter's residence." And hearing it phrased like that, stripped of emotion, reduced to a line on a page, was exactly what I had been waiting for, because once something is written that way, it stops being personal and starts being procedural. Patricia shifted slightly in her seat, just enough to signal she was about to speak, and when she did, her tone was controlled, measured, but missing the certainty it had carried before. "The association has acted in accordance with established guidelines to maintain community standards," she began, choosing each word carefully. "And any discrepancies in boundary interpretation were based on historical understanding." And that phrase, historical understanding, hung in the air like a soft attempt to reframe something that had already been documented differently. Thomas leaned forward slightly, one hand resting on the open folder, and spoke without raising his voice. "The county records do not support that interpretation," he said, calm, direct, and the room seemed to tighten just a little at that. The subtle shift when certainty meets contradiction. There was a pause, not long, but enough for everyone to register what had just been said, and one of the other board members leaned in, flipping through his own set of papers. "Are we confirming that the property in question is not within HOA jurisdiction?" he asked, looking between Patricia and Thomas nodded once. No hesitation. "That is correct." And the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. Patricia's hands tightened slightly on the table, fingers pressing together, and for a moment, she did not speak, like she was recalculating in real time. And then she said, "There may have been an administrative oversight." And that was the first real shift, not denial, not defense, but acknowledgement wrapped in careful language. And I could feel the room change with it, the quiet understanding that something had moved from assumption into fact. I sat there without saying a word, just listening, watching the way the conversation unfolded without me needing to push it, because this was never about arguing my position. It was about letting the right information reach the right place. And as the board members began discussing corrective actions, liability concerns, and the need to review prior notices issued under incorrect authority, I realized something that most people never get to see from this side. When the system starts correcting itself, it does not do it loudly. It does it precisely, line by line, record by record, until the version of events that remains is the one that can actually be proven. The room did not erupt or react the way people imagine when something shifts this much. There was no dramatic moment, no raised voices, just a slow tightening of focus as the board members leaned further into their documents. Pens moving, pages turning, the quiet mechanics of accountability taking over where assumption had been sitting just minutes before. And I watched as one of the board members adjusted his glasses and spoke again. We need to address the enforcement actions already taken. His voice steady but more deliberate now, like each word carried a consequence he could already see forming. And another member nodded, flipping through a stack of printed notices. These were issued under the premise of jurisdiction, she said, tapping one page lightly, which we are now confirming did not exist. And that sentence landed clean, no emotion, just fact, the kind that does not leave room for interpretation. Patricia sat still at the center of the table, but the stillness was different now, not composed, not controlled, but contained, like she was holding herself in place while everything around her moved without her input. And I noticed the way her eyes shifted between the speakers, not challenging, not correcting, just tracking, absorbing, adjusting. Thomas leaned slightly forward again, his voice cutting through the room without needing volume. There is also the matter of the police report filed yesterday, he said, and I could feel the air change again, subtle, but real, because that was the moment the situation crossed from internal correction into something external, something that involved more than just their own procedures. One of the board members looked up quickly, brows tightening. On what basis was that initiated? He asked, and there was a pause, not long, but enough to expose the absence of a solid answer, and Patricia finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. Based on the understanding that the property was non-compliant within association boundaries, and even as she said it, you could hear the shift, the difference between stating something as truth and explaining something that had already been proven incorrect. Thomas did not interrupt. He just opened the folder again and slid a document slightly forward on the table. The responding officer documented that the property owner stated he was not part of the HOA. He said, calm, precise. And that statement was not verified before escalation. And that word escalation carried its own weight, not dramatic, but procedural, the kind that triggers review rather than reaction. The man at the center of the table exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead for a brief second before straightening again. Then we need to formally acknowledge that this was handled improperly, he said. And there it was. Not an accusation, not a debate, just a recognition, clean and unavoidable. And as those words settled into the room, I could feel the entire structure of the situation finalize, not in a loud way, but in a way that could not be undone. I remained where I was, hands resting loosely on my knees, not moving, not speaking, because there was nothing to add, nothing to push. This was already moving exactly where it needed to go. And as the discussion continued, shifting into next steps, corrective notices, internal review procedures, and communication with affected parties, I realized how different this looked from the outside compared to what people expect. Because accountability is not explosive, it is methodical, it is written, reviewed, and confirmed until there is only one version left that can stand. Patricia finally spoke again, but this time there was no authority in it, just formality. We will need to notify Mr. Carter that all prior notices are withdrawn, she said, and the phrasing was careful, precise, but it carried the admission clearly enough, and one of the board members nodded. And a written clarification of property status, he added, pen already moving as he wrote it down, turning it into something official, something that would exist. Beyond this room, I glanced briefly at Thomas, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to me directly, but to the process itself, like everything had aligned the way it was supposed to. And as I looked back toward the table, listening to the final pieces fall into place, I understood something that most people never get to witness this clearly. When someone builds their authority on something that is not verified, every step they take on that foundation eventually becomes part of the record that corrects them. And once that record starts forming, it does not stop until the truth is the only thing left standing. The meeting did not end with a bang. It ended with signatures, with pens moving across paper, with quiet confirmations that sounded almost routine if you did not understand what they meant. and I stayed seated until the last line of discussion settled into silence, until chairs began to shift and people started gathering their things, because leaving too early feels like urgency, and I had none of that left, not anymore. As I stood, the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft rustle of paper filled the room, ordinary sounds wrapping around something that had just been decided without needing to be declared dramatic, and I walked toward the front slowly, not to confront, not to claim anything, just to close the distance that had been there all evening. Thomas was the first to look up, giving me a small nod that carried more understanding than words, and one of the board members turned slightly in his chair, adjusting his papers before speaking. "Mr. Carter, we will be issuing a formal written clarification regarding your property status." His voice professional, controlled, but noticeably more careful than it would have been before, "and all prior notices will be rescinded," and I nodded once. "I appreciate the correction," I said, keeping it simple, because acknowledgement matters more than reaction. Patricia did not speak immediately, and when she finally did, her voice was steady but stripped of everything it had carried before. "There was an error in how this was handled," she said, not looking directly at me at first, then lifting her eyes just enough to meet mine briefly. "That will be addressed internally." And there was no need for more than that, because the weight of the situation had already shifted where it needed to go. I gave a small nod in return, not dismissive, not forgiving, just acknowledging the statement for what it was, and as I stepped back, turning toward the exit, I could feel the difference in the room, not tense anymore, not divided, just resolved in a way that only happens when facts settle into place and leave no space for anything else. Outside, the air had cooled slightly, the evening settling in with that quiet hum of distant traffic and the faint chirp of insects starting to take over where daytime noise had been, and I walked back to my truck at an unhurried pace, the gravel shifting under each step, the same driveway, the same neighborhood. Nothing physically changed, but everything had been clarified. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, looking out at the line where the streetlights began to flicker on one by one, casting long, steady pools of light across the pavement. And I let the stillness sit for just a second longer than necessary, because moments like this do not need to be rushed past. When I finally pulled away, the road felt the same as it always had, smooth, predictable, leading exactly where it was supposed to. And by the time I turned into my driveway, the house was quiet again, the porch light casting a soft glow across the steps, everything exactly where it belonged. I stepped out, closing the door with a solid, familiar sound, and walked up to the same spot where all of this had started, the same place where flashing lights had once reflected against the glass. And now there was nothing but stillness, the kind that does not come from absence, but from resolution. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the folded copy of the report from the day before, the paper now slightly creased but still clear, still readable, and I looked at it for a moment before tucking it back away, not because I needed it anymore, but because it represented something that most people overlook. Until it matters, that documentation does not argue. It does not raise its voice. It simply exists, waiting for the moment it becomes the only version of the story that can be proven. I stood there a second longer, feeling the cool air settle around me, and then I turned, heading inside, closing the door behind me with a quiet finality that matched everything that had just happened. And as the lock clicked into place, one thought stayed with me. Simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. Respect is not something you enforce with authority. It is something you maintain by understanding where your authority ends. Because the moment you cross that line without knowing it, the system you rely on does not protect you. It corrects you.